At one point, the Aral Sea was the fourth largest lake in the world. It supported fishing communities, moderated the climate, and stretched further than some countries. Then, within a single human lifetime, it almost disappeared due to a massive 1960s Soviet era irrigation project. Hello, listeners, and welcome to H2O and Beyond. My name is Alex Hahn, and each week we dive into the science, systems, and stories behind the water we use every day. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Sarah Cameron, a professor of history at the University of Maryland. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Cameron. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much.
So, before we get started, I usually like to ask my guests if they could give us a little introduction about who you are, what you do, and the place you work at.
Sure. So I'm a historian. So historians look at water too. Water is a very interdisciplinary topic, I would say. My position at Maryland, I'm a historian of the Soviet Union, and I offer courses related to Soviet history, to the history of modern Central Asia, to environmental history. I got my interest actually in the former Soviet Union through the Peace Corps. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Russia. Now seems a bit hard to imagine the Peace Corps there, but it was, and I really kind of fell in love with a lot of the culture, the region, and also the history. And so that's in part what drew me to get a PhD in this topic.
And what exactly did you do as a member of the Peace Corps?
Yeah, so I was in the Russian Far East. I had no idea about Russia when I went there. In fact, I didn't even speak Russian at all. And I remember it was quite funny. I had my interview with the Peace Corps recruiter, and she said, "Where would you like to go?" And I knew some Spanish, so I said, "Well, maybe Latin America." And I said, "But there's just one thing. I hate the cold." And so I write this down, but then where did I get my assignment? The Russian Far East. At that time, Peace Corps divided Russia up into two halves. So there was Russia West and the Russian Far East because it was such a big country.
Mhm.
So I was over near Asia, right near Japan, Korea, that side of Russia, place that most Americans don't think about. And I was assigned to be an English teacher in a village school. And this was quite difficult initially for a couple of reasons. One is Peace Corps didn't have a long history there. Unlike other parts of the globe where Peace Corps has been there for 30 years, many people were deeply suspicious of me. The Cold War had not long
Mhm.
ago ended, and people thought I was honestly a spy. They didn't understand what the Peace Corps was doing. And then, I really didn't have any Russian at all. And so it's just very difficult to work alongside colleagues. And Russian is a very difficult language. But, gradually I came to learn it. And, it was a really quite amazing experience.
How fluent in Russian would you say you are right now?
Well, I guess fluent is always a relative, term, and
Mhm.
Russian is a very hard language. So I feel perfectly comfortable in ordinary
Yeah.
situations, and I use Russian a lot for my work. I read a lot in Russian, particularly for this project, and I feel pretty comfortable doing that. Now, if you told me to give a highly technical talk about water hydrology in Russian, I cannot do that. So it's various
Mhm.
levels, I would say, right, of fluency.
Well, I think that brings us to, my first question, which is, for listeners who aren't familiar, what was the Aral Sea and how big was it at its peak?
Sure. So, the Aral Sea, at its peak, was the fourth largest inland body of water. It was a really kind of a massive area. One way to think about it, it was the size of the Republic of Ireland, so really the size of a country, actually. And it is located in a place that we don't think about so much, which is Central Asia. I teach courses on Central Asia at the University of Maryland. It's really interesting. We talk about with the students, why is it that Americans have so little idea about this place in the world? Why is it sort of off most people's mental imaginaries, even though it is really important for area for so many reasons. So the Aral Sea is located uh, before it started to disappear. Part of the Aral Sea was located in what was then a Soviet Republic, Kazakhstan,
Mhm.
and the other part was located in Uzbekistan. And at that time, both of them were Soviet republics, so the Aral Sea was contained within the Soviet Union. After the collapse, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan became independent countries. They're Turkic speaking countries, Muslim countries, and so they plus Turkmenistan, another state, are the ones dealing with the Aral Sea issue today. So the Aral Sea, another point I should mention is that it's a salt lake. So that is a very specific type of lake. You are, of course, listeners in the U.S. would be familiar with the Great Salt Lake in Utah. That's one type of salt lake. Another one would be the Salton Sea. Another one would be Lake Chad. Another one would be the Dead Sea. So these are specific type of water body that one can find in arid environments. And they differ from freshwater really due to their high composition of salt and other minerals. And they're very highly reactive bodies of water.
Mhm.
Scientists, I've heard the expression that they're like the canaries in the coal mine. They sort of tell us what we can't see. And the Aral Sea, like other bodies, so other salt lakes, has actually risen and fallen over the course of its history. So this retreat, the modern retreat, the 1960s retreat, is not the first retreat of the Aral Sea we've seen. But it is distinctive, actually, in many ways, particularly in terms of its effects on human health.
And just how salty is the sea compared to the other salty bodies of water that you mentioned?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that I can tell you for sure. I mean,
Mhm.
in terms of the Dead Sea, I've heard depictions of people like floating on the
Yeah.
surface of the Dead Sea. I don't think that I've seen such a such characterizations with the Aral Sea. It would also, I think, the answer to your question would, of course, depend on what period of time we're looking at because the salinity of the Aral Sea changed over time. And it also would depend on where in the Aral Sea we're talking about. So, for instance, where the Aral Sea is fed by two rivers, and when these rivers flow at the mouth of these rivers where they flow into the sea, that is where you would find higher concentrations of, say, fresh water. So
Mhm.
you would find different species of fish there just because the salinity levels are also quite different.
See, and how did these local communities rely on this sea, especially the fishing communities?
Mhm. So, if we look back historically, many of the people who live around the sea, so on the Kazakh side, the most of the people who live around the sea are Kazakhs, a nomadic Turkic speaking group. On the Uzbekistani side, most of the people who live around the sea are Karakalpaks. They are a Turkic speaking minority within Uzbekistan. Today, they have their own autonomous republic, which borders the sea, called Karakalpakstan, and the Karakalpaks were also nomadic. So, as nomads, fishing was kind of a supplementary activity. They didn't primarily define themselves actually as fishermen. But what happens is, over the course of the Soviet era, the Soviets actually, ironically, I guess we can say, tried to build up the fishing industry. This was their initial intention. And so they actually tried to settle the people who lived around the sea. So that would be the Karakalpaks and the Kazakhs. They tried to settle them, turn them away from this seasonal herding that they were practicing with their animal herds, and actually make them into fishermen and to build up the fishing community. So fishing did actually quite become really quite important to the people who lived around the sea, and fishing became an important part of their culture and identity. But that was a kind of more recent phenomena, something born of the Soviet Union's interventions. In terms of the overall significance of the Aral Sea as a fishing body of water, it depends again at what period of time we're looking at. But even at the height of fishing production, which is probably like, I would say maybe the 50s, the Aral Sea constituted it was the most important fishing body in Central Asia, but if we look at the Soviet Union's overall fish production, it was probably only about 5 to 7%. So relatively small. Nonetheless, it was seen as important also for the types of species that it that you could catch in the sea. So different types of carp and bream, and a lot of the species in the sea, in the Aral Sea, were perceived as high quality fish or fish that consumers like to eat. So I think for that reason, perhaps the fishing significance is a little bit more than the actual percentage might suggest.
I see. And, how did the sea affect the surrounding climate? Because I know that these bodies of water are actually, yeah, pretty important in regulating.
As far as I know, it played a kind of a moderating effect
Hmm.
on the climate. So the sea, and this is sort of getting ahead. I know another question of yours is not actually a sea. That is a misnomer, right? It's called a sea, but it's an endohyic lake, or a lake with no outflow, so a
Hmm.
terminal lake. So there are two rivers. These rivers originate in the high mountain chains of Asia, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, and they are the major feeders of the Aral Sea, because in this region, it's a region where there's very little precipitation, and also temperatures are very high, and evaporation is very high. So, as far as I understand, the Aral Sea played an important role in moderating the climate. So, in making, for instance, winters not as cold and summers not as hot. And with the almost total disappearance of the sea, they've noticed quite a difference in terms of the overall climate of the region.
Yeah, and I think this brings us to, my questions on why exactly the sea disappeared. But actually, before
Yeah.
that, I want to try and understand, like, you mentioned that the Soviet Union used to want these people to become, fishermen, but
Mhm.
then from my understanding, was there this sudden shift of trying to shift towards agriculture instead?
I think that one of the issues is that I think they came to prize cotton production much more than they came to prize fish production. That they saw cotton production as much, much more valuable. Even been reading articles where they explicitly say this. This was explicitly framed in that way. It said, "Well, we can produce, however many rubles worth of fish, or we could really sacrifice actually the sea to cotton production, and we could make the Soviet Union self-sufficient in terms of cotton production." So I think initially, perhaps cotton was not. Cotton became more important to the Soviet Union over time, I would say. So it's really in the post-war period that we see cotton production actually taking off in the Soviet Union. There's an enormous jump in production. So the Soviet Union becomes, by 1983, the second largest cotton producer in the world. And cotton is important here to the story, because it's essentially cotton that strangles the sea. You might frame it that way. So these two rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, that feed the sea, they divert the waters from those rivers, and they push it towards agriculture, because cotton is a really thirsty, water intensive crop. And Central Asia is a really arid region. So cotton can do well there, but it needs a lot of water to survive. The Soviets built enormous canals. They built one of the most enormous canals in the world at the time through Turkmenistan that diverted a lot of the water from the Amu Darya, to feed the sea. Unfortunately, a lot of these irrigation canals were not well built, so they were unlined. By that, I mean they were not lined with concrete. They were not sort of done efficiently. There was a lot of secondary salinization of the soil, but this begins to basically slowly strangle the sea, deprive it of this water inflow that was needed. But a lot of, I would say, not the f- the full aspects of what would happen were not understood, but the basic premise that if you dramatically boost irrigation, that this is going to have a dramatic impact on the water coming into the sea, this was understood. And this was acknowledged actually that this is what we are doing. And this idea that the sea somehow was useless. I mean, they even used that term. This actually dates, it's not even a Soviet idea. It dates back to the Russian Empire, where various Russian imperial planners said, what's that body of water doing there and out there, and can't we quote unquote use that more efficiently. So some of these ideas had been kind of bouncing around for a while, but it's not really until they begin to focus much more on cotton.
Mhm.
Cotton was also perceived in the context of the Cold War. So, by the post World War II period, and after the death of Stalin, the Cold War really becomes enters into full force, and it's by that period that cotton was also seen as increasingly important um, due to national security, even military means, because cotton is really important actually in terms of the military, both in terms of, you know, making
Yeah.
uniforms, but also in terms of ammunition, gunpowder, and so on. So this was also one of the driving forces behind the upsurge in cotton production.
And over like what year did this occur, like, or over what period of years did this shift towards cotton occur?
So cotton production had begun. I mean, there was cotton production even before the Russian Empire entered into the region. The Russian Empire entered into the region. Cotton production began, but in a somewhat haphazard fashion, I would say. And then in the 1920s and 30s, it accelerates. But really, the big takeoff is in the post-war period, which also more or less, of course, coincides with the Aral Sea's demise. The Aral Sea really begins to shrink in the 1960s, and it's in this period that we also see the greatest kind of upsurge, actually, in cotton production, and the Soviet Union becoming one of the world's largest cotton powers.
And who's making all these decisions? Was it just one person at the top, or was it a collective group of people that decided, like, hey, we should switch away from fishing and go more in towards cotton?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And sometimes I wish I had that document, right? Where people would say, point that out very explicitly, but they don't. I think the fishing industry, as far as I can tell, was never, if we take the fishing industry or the fishing ministry in
Mhm.
the Soviet Union as a whole, it was never, seems to me, to be very powerful, actually, very influential. But cotton, because it was deemed to be something connected to national security, it was seen as much more important. I think also, it's true that the Soviets did focus a lot on agricultural goods, right? Like I know from my previous book, of course, they focused a lot more on grain and meat. These were really, really, and this is why in part, we see such terrifying famines that happened in the 1930s under Stalin, particularly things like the Ukrainian famine, Holodomor, and Kazakh famine in Kazakhstan, which was the subject of my first book. But I don't. And so they understood that calories, what people eat, this is
Mhm.
also really important to them. But to me, it seems that they never came to conceive of fish as an essential part of people's diet in the same way, right? And if you think about it, also fish is kind of tricky to transport too.
Yeah.
This is something that came up a lot actually in the case of the Aral Sea because this fish was, supposedly going all around the Soviet Union. They didn't have things like refrigerated fishing ships, right?
Mhm.
To transport the fish across the sea. And so they were reduced actually very often to salting the fish because that was the cheapest way to preserve it. So I think that's probably another factor here that fish never became a central part or is seen as a central part of people's diets in the same way that other goods that were produced, like grain and meat, were seen as essential parts of kind of feeding the population.
What did the fishermen, like, living on the Aral Sea think about when they saw this government, like, started basically saying, like, "Hey, like, your industry isn't that important anymore. We're gonna switch to something else." What did they think?
Well, I don't think that decision, it was never said so explicitly to them.
Mhm.
And also, this region. the region that I study, the lands around the Aral Sea, it was, in many senses made quite remote from Moscow. So they didn't always have the best sense of what Moscow was up to. Um, I think that over time, so the sea initially in the 60s, it sort of retreats slowly. And I think, given the previous history of the Aral Sea, as I've said, it has retreated and come back over the course of its history several times. There's a long pattern of that. I mean, if you imagine that you're a fisherman there in the 1960s, you might think, oh, well, this is just this pattern happening again. That I know that, due to courses, both natural and anthropogenic, that the sea has come back and retreated and so on. Um, but I think there were various promises made by Moscow, that, well, yes, we're going to take some out for cotton production, but don't you worry, we're still going to prop up the fishing industry. So one of the things that they tried to do, actually, and this has also been one of the interesting parts of my project, is that I got into this and I thought, well, they just drained the sea and they didn't do anything. No, they were constantly actually tinkering with the sea to see, even as the salinity rose and even as the water started to disappear, what can we extract from it? And so they were introducing, for instance, so salinity goes up, certain types of species of fish die. So they actually tried to introduce salt tolerant species of fish, flounder, for instance, which can survive at a higher salinity, to see if they could get the flounder industry to take off. So they noticed, another thing is, they noticed that many of the fish in the shallower waters began to die off, or they got new types of boats and they started to utilize new and different types of methods of fishing, like deep sea trawlers, to extract
Mhm.
fish from parts of the sea where they hadn't gotten them before.
What?
So they were trying to do various things to kind of prop up the fishing industry, but at some point, all of these failed as well. I mean, for much of the Soviet period, it was very difficult to speak out against the Soviet state, right? This was a highly, at times, a highly repressive state, and authoritarian, particularly under the rule of Stalin. But then, you do see definitely certain elements of people trying to speak out about what was happening. Not only people in the region, but also, you might imagine, people with the fishing ministry who were deeply concerned, bureaucrats in that ministry who were deeply concerned about what was happening, and also scientists. They played a really important role in this, because they said, look, here's what we see, right? Is going to happen. And then the other area that becomes really important where people begin to speak out is the area of health, because the Aral Sea's demise began to affect public health in a really big way. But it's not really, you couldn't really say any of this openly until the Gorbachev era. So this was something that was sort of said, kind of, in official documents, but not out in the open. And it's really only in the Gorbachev era where Gorbachev introduces kind of new terms of public discussion, and opens up the floodgates to a whole discussions of kind of new and so-called forbidden topics. Then you really see people speaking out about the Aral Sea case in a pretty blunt way. So that would be, the late 1980s.
And once these fish started really dying off and all the experiments failing, how are these residents affected? Do they lose their jobs?
Yeah. So, exactly as you said, they lose their jobs. They actually shuttered the fishing industry in the late 1980s. The sea also splits into two in the late 1980s. So, the North Aral Sea and the South Aral Sea. North Aral Sea is mostly on the Kazakhstani side. South Aral Sea is mostly on the Uzbekistani side. So you have this very tragic situation where you have people who the Soviet state has spent a lot of effort trying to build up to be fishermen and make that central to their identities. I even in my book I have all these sort of very very poignant stories about people who've been named, fishing captain who's been named a hero of socialist labor, and then he has to leave. He's unemployed. He has to go searching for work, right? And he's a hero of socialist labor, but he can't fish anymore. So some people actually end up migrating. They end up leaving.
Hmm.
They go to some of the cities, the area cities, in search of work. Other people become seasonal fishermen, so they are still based in the region, but they go seasonally to other lakes and so on to try and fish. There are actually various drainage lakes created from the Aral Sea's demise. So these would be bodies of water from the runoff from irrigation. Many of them are not. Really very safe for fishing because they are filled with kind of lots of pesticides, chemicals, salt from cotton farming. Nonetheless, for many years, the Soviet Union does allow and encourage fishing in them. So that's what many people were doing as they were trying to go and fish in some of these lakes. And some fishermen, of course, turn to other activities like camel breeding. Camel breeding is sort of suitable for the dried up lands around the Aral Sea because they're very kind of salty and saline. It's one of the few animals that can survive there. So there's a variety of reactions that you see to this.
How long did it take for, residents to really notice that the sea was shrinking? Because I know like they once they built the canals, it was noticeable, but I just want to know like how long did it take for it to really get this bad?
Well, scientists begin to notice it already in the 60s. You can find a lot of discussion of it sort of in the scientific literature. I would say for residents, it's probably more like the 70s when they sort of really realize, gosh, something is wrong. And it's not just the sea shrinking, it's other indications of what, for instance, a big rise in dust storms, a big change in the local climate. For many animals in the region, it becomes impossible to survive. So in the south of the sea, there was a delta. The Darya Delta flows into the Aral Sea. And this delta environment had a lot of reeds and plants that grew in it. And so, in addition to fish farming or fishing, another big industry in the delta in the southern region was muskrat farming. And so they sold lots of pelts and other things related to that. But as the environment changes and as the delta sort of disappears, these reeds die, and so they're not able to do muskrat farming anymore. So there's all kinds of hints, that something really was awry, something was going on.
And just to put into some context, how much did the lake shrink?
Yeah, I think it's on the order of 90% of the lake disappears. I think it's equivalent to both draining, for instance, both Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. You've heard
Wow.
that statistic mentioned. The UN Secretary General has in 2017 actually called it the worst environmental catastrophe of the 20th century. So it is generally acknowledged in many senses as one of kind of the paradigmatic environmental catastrophes, the disappearance of the Aral Sea.
Yeah, and you mentioned dust storms, which I know are a big part of when these endorheic lakes they dry up and they expose the lake bed. I know on this
Yeah.
channel we've talked about the Salton Sea and the Great Salt Lake, and they've been dealing with the
Yeah.
same problem too. What's it like at the Aral Sea?
It's really, very, very, very scary, striking, disorienting. I have not been caught in one myself, though I've seen video of them and I've talked to people who have gone through them. So for me, what it reminds me, I read with my students sometimes a lot of the literature on the Dust Bowl
Mhm.
in the 1930s in the US. And it's not really until I read some of that literature that I understood how disorienting, how devastating, such an experience, could be. It can make it impossible to see, to drive, to kind of breathe, to go out of the house. People would describe to me how, they sort of knew when some were coming, and so they would have to stay indoors for days, right? Not to go out of the house. I also notice many people sometimes particularly if dust storm is coming, they'll like cover their face or their mouth so as not to breathe in some of the dust. the one issue that has not been very well researched in the case of the Aral Sea is the reason why people are getting sick. So we know that all kinds of illnesses, infectious diseases, cancers, respiratory diseases, and so on have a much higher incidence for people who live around the sea. But the causal pathway by which that is happening is not that well understood or has not been that well researched. But one um, big reason that people point to is the dust, right? That
Mhm.
there's toxic things coming around in the dust. And so that is also why, some people try to be very cautious about dealing with the dust. Nonetheless, I've understood from researchers or people who live in the region that it's not very well understood what you do about that, right? Do you not go out at certain times of the day, for instance, or that question is not well understood.
And yeah, I know there's like in other regions of the world they find carcinogens inside the dust and old
Yeah.
pesticides. Is it the same thing for the Aral Sea?
Yeah, so it would be both salts and various minerals from the seabed in the lake, as well as that's exactly right. So pesticides, things from, cotton production. So I think these are the things that are understood to be toxic, right? And they find their way not only into, people's lungs, right, when you breathe, but also into the food supply. They might like coat things like the vegetables and things that you would buy in the market and so on.
And yeah, I'm wondering, what do the communities there look like right now? Because it's been, tens of years since the Aral Sea, fully shrank down all the way to that
Mhm.
90% that you mentioned. So yeah, I'm just wondering, how are they doing right now?
Yeah, so I've actually tried with this project, the book that I'm writing, to spend a lot of time in the region because I think one of the corrections I really wanted to make is that there's an enormous amount of scientific literature on the Aral Sea, and it's almost the sea has been represented as a environmental problem rather than a human problem,
Mhm.
right? That it's a problem almost of like the shrinking of the fish and the changes to the sea, but it's almost as if the people are not in the picture at all. And I think, what I've told you earlier, the fact that we have so little medical research on the problems around the
Mhm.
sea, that's kind of emblematic of this issue, right? And I make no pretensions to being a doctor, but I can, as a historian, tell you a lot more about the culture and about how people reacted to this disaster. And I think I can also, try and will in my book make a stab at the question of why have these medical issues been ignored? Why haven't we been paying more attention to it? So one of the things when I first went there, a lot of people said, gosh, I'm sure it's going to be so depressing. Weren't you depressed when you came back there? I said, no. It's actually quite the opposite for me. That I found it really very hopeful in many senses, to see how many people are people who have endured a, yes, terrible loss, but who are also uh, adapting and, in some sense, even thriving amidst the most difficult, conditions imaginable. So I've been both to, I should say here also to set out that the Aral Sea, what we might think of as the disaster zone,
Mhm.
is actually bigger than most people think. So it encompasses 3 countries. So there are 3 countries that are part of my study. Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. Those are the 2 that bordered the sea, that border the remains of the sea. And then there's a third, Turkmenistan, which, because of the way that the dust got blown and the climate changes, northern Turkmenistan is also profoundly affected by this crisis, even though it does not actually border the water. The Aral Sea was never in Turkmenistan, but it's kind of historically and culturally linked. And I there are differences between these places, in part differences that have grown up because of the very different approaches that the countries of that these 3 countries have taken, right? They're different states with different politics and so on. The sea also began to retreat much earlier on the Uzbek side. And so there you don't really feel the sea's presence or the fishing culture as much, whereas the sea is closer on the Kazakhstani side. But I think one big corrective that going to the region really made for me is I think often in outsiders' imaginaries, there's the sense that everyone is left, that these societies have collapsed and they're not there anymore. And I think that's deeply incorrect. That a lot of people, these are their homes. This is the place where their ancestors are buried. This is a place that they really want to stay in. And so I found that, just really interesting that there are a lot of people who, even they have the opportunity to leave, they don't want to leave because the place itself is really, really important to them. And I was just also very impressed at the various means um, that people had taken to preserve their culture actually in the region and to sort of pass the memory, even if the sea had disappeared, to pass on points of that culture to the younger generation. The area itself, I should say, again, we think of it in outsiders' minds, the area around the Aral Sea. We might think of stereotypically as kind of a disaster zone, but if you go there, it's also strikingly beautiful. So that was another really great takeaway for me is just the landscape is very different, very stark, right? You can think of this as, big sky country with the sky kind of yawns for miles overhead. Very, very arid. It's very difficult for a lot of things to grow, but also very, very beautiful region.
And I was actually quite shocked to hear that because when you search up Aral Sea on the internet and all you find are these stories of communities that have been destroyed, and you see all
Yeah.
these pictures of the sea and with like the dead fish.
Yeah.
So that's actually very surprising to hear that.
Yeah, I have a colleague, a geographer, who really makes critiques that exact point, and she says, "Look, why is it that the Aral Sea is always represented as a place without people? That all you see in terms of images is ships adrift in the sand.
Hmm.
That's one very popular, and that is actually really how most people know the Aral Sea. So some people say Aral Sea, I haven't heard of that, and then I say, well, do you know these pictures of ships adrift in the sand? Yes, 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 yes. Or the other way it's represented in the West is often through these time series maps, right? From overhead of the sea's disappearance. But again, if you think about all of those images, right, if you didn't know anything else, you would just think that everyone is left and that there's no one there, right? That these societies have collapsed. But I think, that would be deeply incorrect.
Yeah. And I know there have been recovery efforts in the past to sort of try and restore the sea. I know now the sea has split into sort of like a north and south end, right? And is that because of the dam that Kazakhstan has built? I know they've tried to sort of revive the lake in recent years.
So the seed's actually technically, I believe in three parts right now because part of South Aral Sea has actually split off into another part. So there's on the Uzbekistani side mostly there's two parts, Kazakhstani side there's one part. So the divergence in the fate of the two kind of we can say national halves of the sea began even during the late Soviet era. So the water on the Uzbekistani side began to retreat earlier. And the Uzbekistani side began to experience the effects of the disaster first. So there are probably a couple of reasons for that. One is that the Amu Darya, which feeds into the sea on the Uzbekistani side, was more affected by irrigation and provided more of the water flow for the sea. And then the other thing is the physical characteristics of the Uzbekistani side are different in that it's a delta region, whereas that is not true of the Kazakhstani side. And the way the Sirdarya, the river over there, feeds into the sea. So the sea itself split into two halves well before any dam was constructed. However, um, as far as I understand it, even after the split of the two seas, before the construction of the dam, some water from the Kazakhstani side, the North Aral Sea side, would still spill over into the Uzbekistani side and sort of in some senses, help keep it afloat. So when they finally did build a dam in 2005, that was on the Kazakhstani side, they built a dam. One way to think of it is a pretty drastic solution, actually. It's like cutting off a limb, right, to save a sick patient, because it did mean that this portion of the sea on the Kazakhstani side could be saved. Um, at saved, I mean that in quotation marks, because sometimes I think the idea of saving the sea, or bringing back the sea, again, I say that in quotation marks, it kind of idealizes or assumes that there was always a stable sea going back historically, right? That there was always an Aral Sea with a stable water level, but that was never true historically, right? It has always sort of varied. It has always been dependent upon regional water needs. But in any case, when they put the dam in 2005 with World Bank funds, that does sort of cut off the possibility of doing something similar on the Uzbekistani side. There, as far as I understand, though, it just wasn't possible from a technical standpoint to put in a dam on the other side of the sea, on the Uzbekistani side.
So I guess I'm just wondering, how exactly does this dam work? Is this dam located like on the inside of the sea and it helps keep the water in, or?
So the dam is located, I believe, at the mouth of the Darya, and it prevents some of the water from either spilling into the sort of steppe or the desert that surrounds it, or alternately spilling back into the other side of the sea, the South Aral Sea.
So I guess it sort of just keeps the water inside in the northern end, right?
Yeah, and it's much, much smaller, right, than what the sea was originally, which has, some residents sort of feel, I think generally in the region there's happiness, that the dam is seen as a very positive thing and a positive step forward on the Kazakhstani side, but there's also a lot of sense that, well, um, this is not really what we want to see happen. That what we want to see happen is for there's still discussion of phase 2 of the dam project, which would bring the waters of the sea all the way back to the former port of Aral, is it's called in Kazakh, or Aralsk in Russian. This is the former port on the Kazakhstani side. Because it's very poignant when you visit that port today, because you can see all of this infrastructure that had been built around the sea being there, like
Mhm.
restaurants that were supposed to overlook the port. You can see shipping cranes that overlook the former seabed, which is now kind of all dried up. And so I think that's what many people want to see happen, is the water brought all the way back to Aralsk. But I don't know. I mean, now we're also in a situation where other pressures are affecting the dam's performance, and the water flow. One being climate change, right? The other one being downstream use, right? By downstream users, because the Aral Sea is a terminal lake, and these two rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, they flow through several, other countries
Mhm.
before they reach the sea.
Yeah. And what lessons do you think the Aral Sea has taught us?
Yeah, I think many. You know, Sometimes I think there is the tendency to section off, particularly in the height of the Cold War after the Soviet Union's collapse, to section off the Aral Sea case as unique and as uniquely Soviet. And, I think from my own research and from what we see today, this is just not true, right?
Mhm.
That it actually it has many patterns that resemble many other cases, even ones we see in the United States. I'm constantly struck by reading up on the Great Salt Lake, just how much it resembles the Aral Sea case. So I think there's really um important things that we can, learn. The Aral Sea we might think of as like you know, rather than something we can see as uniquely Soviet, maybe something that's even a little bit ahead of its time, something that we're going to see as
Mhm.
happening, as patterns around the world. I think a couple other things we might we might take from it. One is sort of, we think of this as a very remote place, but actually, one of the astonishing things I've come to learn is that, goods that were produced using water from the Aral Sea, they come all over the place, right? Um, that cotton from the Aral Sea, it might be even in the clothes we wear, right? So I think it teaches us that these disasters that we want to confine, these environmental disasters, that we want to think of as very distant from our own worlds, are perhaps, not so distant from from us after all, actually. That's another point as well.
Mhm. And what gives you hope about the Aral Sea?
Yeah, again, I would return to, my experiences of going back in the region, because it's just been for me a really um amazing and an important experience. And I think often when, issues of climate change are represented by the media, they tend to focus on the physical impacts of climate change, right?
Mhm.
That we see, okay, here's this island that is drowning, or here's this iceberg going underwater, and it's almost like the people many of these people who are usually people from the global south, people who are indigenous, right? Their voices are drowned out. That we don't that it's almost like the impression is that these societies have collapsed. And again, I think we need to flip the story. We need to spend more time in these local places and see what people on the ground actually want, because I think that is a really important part of the story, right? There's a lot of talk about restoring the sea, but what do we mean by restoration? Who has a stake in that? Who wants what? And also just that I find that there's just a lot more energy, right, than in the region and on the ground, than and a greater sense of community. That was another thing that really kind of hit home for me, is that, that is also what has helped many people endure and survive, is this kind of very powerful local sense of community and people helping one another out.
Mhm.
And so those are some of the things that have given me hope as I have worked on the project.
Yeah, and, do you have sort of any last words before we wrap this episode up?
No, I don't. Thank you. I'm, hopeful that the book might bring greater attention to water issues, as your podcast have done, and also bring people in the West to take a greater issue in Central Asia, which I think is a really a greatly underappreciated region.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cameron, for joining me on H2O and Beyond today. It was a pleasure having you as a guest.
You're very welcome, Alex. Thank you.
Well, listeners, if you found this episode helpful, please share it with your coworkers and friends. And if you want to learn more about Dr. Cameron's work, I'll link her website and also some of her books there as well for you guys to read about. And as always, if you want to be a guest on the podcast or have any episode suggestions, there'll be a Google form link down in the description below. I'm Alex. Thank you for listening to H2O and Beyond. Stay curious and stay hydrated.